Hello, this is Rabbi Juan Marcos Bejarano Gutierrez, and today we're talking about another book that I wrote called Conversos and the Sabbatean Movement, The Unlikely Supporters of Sabbatai Zevi or Sabbatai Zevi. This is a pre-publication copy, but it's already out in Kindle form and in paperback form. To me, this is a fascinating topic because it sort of continues my interest in my studies of the Converso phenomena. The Conversos, of course, were individuals who themselves had converted to Christianity beginning in 1391 in the Iberian Peninsula, and their descendants continue to be identified by the same term, Conversos or Anusim, Bene Anusim. Sometimes people have raised the question as to how subsequent generations could be characterized under the same term. Well, in Spanish society, Castilian society in particular, Conversos continue to be a group that replicated itself. They were always under this shadow of their ancestors' conversion, and their integration into Castilian society and to a lesser extent in Aragonese society was always in question. So even though their specific time frame, the descendants 2, 3, 4, 5 generations later were separated from the initial conversion period, there was still something there that linked them to their Jewish past. Now, the relevance of this to the Sabbatean movement is that many of the individuals who left the peninsula and journeyed to the Ottoman Empire, to Italy, to Amsterdam, to Germany, became ardent supporters of Sabbatai Zevi. And it's fascinating. Now, why would these individuals who had struggled so much to gain their freedom, to rejoin practicing Jewish communities, why would they be so excited about this individual? Well, of course, there's the issue of redemption, the promise that the Messiah would bring about this restoration of the people of Israel. I think in many ways, Sabbatai Zevi's message of permitting that which was prohibited resonated with them, because if you think about it, these individuals in the peninsula had been forced to live lives that they considered to be idolatrous. They were praying in churches where there were pesilim, as far as they were concerned, statuettes, idols. They were praying to what they considered to be a false deity. They were involved in eating things that they were not permitted and doing things that were simply not acceptable according to halakha. And so I think that for many of them, there was a struggle with guilt. There was a struggle with a sense of anguish. Even though they had left, why hadn't they left earlier? Why didn't their parents leave? Why didn't their grandparents leave? These kinds of issues that stirred a lot of emotions. And I think another component that we have to take into consideration is that just like an immigrant who comes to the United States, especially from certain countries, maybe third world countries or former, communist countries, there's often a difficulty in integrating into the United States or other Western countries because of the dramatic changes that there are, the sense of liberty, freedom of expression, and so forth, economic opportunities. These kinds of things also have to be taken into account, because these individuals were not simply leaving Iberian society and rejoining the Jewish community. They were doing so in the Ottoman Empire, in Italy, in Northern Europe, Dutch Republic, and so forth. And so they're having to deal with that, family separation, financial challenges, the reality that Judaism, as they understood it, may have been very different from what they had expected in the peninsula, because sometimes their only access to pictures of Judaism or images of Judaism would have been through the lens of the Catholic Bible or the Apocrypha. And so the sort of kind of biblical view of what Judaism was supposed to be didn't necessarily take into account the realities of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral tradition, the oral law, of course, rabbinic enactments after the fact, and some of the rigidities that were often characteristic of communities, for example, the one in the community in Amsterdam. The community there was very concerned with appropriate worship, and they were very concerned with appropriate belief. And the influx of ideas that might undermine halachic authority was always a consideration. So, for example, today we take for granted the influence of Kabbalah in different facets of the Siddur, and even in practice and so forth. But for the community in Amsterdam, Kabbalah was a serious issue of concern, because for many individuals who sort of leaned in that direction, there was always sort of a tension between are Kabbalistic perspectives, do they override the halakha? And so this was something that the community in Amsterdam was often very much on the lookout for. Now, the Conversos who supported Sabbatai Zevi, I think were also dealing with the issue of anguish and the things that they had undergone themselves and practice. They were looking for redemption. Once he converted to Islam in 1666 at the threat of martyrdom or death, you would think, or martyrdom or conversion, you would think that they would sort of leave that attachment and to sort of pick up the pieces and move forward. But many of them continue to support him, certainly in smaller numbers, but many continue to identify with him because of this bizarre idea of a debased Messiah. Now, that idea, of course, is in many ways, you could argue, is characteristic of Christianity, the idea that the humiliation of the Messiah is part of the divine plan. In Christianity, Jesus is crucified, he is rejected, he is beaten, he dies. And so his goals are not accomplished, and they are, in Christian theology, deferred, to another time, to the second advent or the second coming. Now, in the case of Sabbatai Zevi, the idea here of converting to Islam, you think would be offensive, but having lived this dissimulation, practicing Catholicism outwardly while wanting to retain Jewish identity, it sort of makes sense to a lot of Conversos, a lot of Bnei Anusim. And in fact, you find the Domeh, these individuals who followed Sabbatai Zevi, who converted to Islam, they continued to practice this kind of crypto-Judaism for centuries. And of course, it changes over time, and it becomes less and less connected to what we would consider to be standard Jewish practice. But the idea that, we have a facade and we are living out our true faith in expectation of the redemption, it makes sense to many of the individuals who were conversos and who followed. And I think in many cases, because of maybe their inability to grasp classical Judaism theologically, and especially in terms of halakha practice, this idea of another category was almost attractive. We can't live out these things because we don't live in this ideal society, so we sort of have to defer proper observance for the future. So these are some of the things that I talk about in this book. What's also interesting is that if you look at some of the gatherings, if you will, for lack of a better term, the prayer gatherings of the Sabbatean movement, what you find is fascinating from a sociological religious standpoint. What I mean by that is, if you're familiar with contemporary religious expressions, you can look on YouTube and find expressions of charismatic Christians and different groups that might be affiliated with them. You see those kinds of characteristics played out in the circles of the Sabbateans, where there's this sort of drive towards what they consider to be prophecy, ecstatic experience, and almost these kind of charismatic expressions that are not generally typical of classical Jewish tradition. I mean, we find some elements of prophecy, nevuah, or healing, things of that nature. But in this particular context, it's a very different type of melding almost of these religious traditions, which is sort of a fascinating study in and of itself. But I don't know. I sometimes wonder if those kinds of expressions drew conversos because they were different. They also possibly because in many ways they were reflective of the Illuminist movement in Spain, the Iluminados. These individuals who sort of left classical Catholicism and sort of transferred their ideas of spirituality and God to sort of another category, and many Conversos joined that in the early 1500s. So there's so many areas that could be researched about why people were drawn to this. But in any case, it's a short book. I like these short books because I think they're digestible for people. As I noted, it is out. It's just the pre-publication copy that I had. And it's a short read. I think it's fascinating if you're interested in the Converso experience and crypto-Judaism, if you're interested in the Sabbatean movement. I think it's a very good overview of some of the critical issues that are related to that. And you can find it on Amazon. Just look for my name, Juan Marcos Bejarano Gutierrez. And you can also, if you go to modern-scribe.com, you can actually sign up and you'll get a free copy of the book that I wrote titled The Jews of Iberia. It's sort of an overview of the Sephardic experience in the Iberian Peninsula. And you can also follow me at cryptojewisheducation.com. There's a lot of articles that I've put up, links, resources, videos So I hope to see you in the next video, and I'll talk to you then.